Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Gregory Ormsby Maury. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. This is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. We hold webinars approximately monthly. And today's presentation is with Joe Orefice. Our presentations run about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. We'll probably stop and take a break at the hour for those who do have to go on to other things at the end of the presentation. So Joe Orefice is a professor of forestry at Paul Smith's College in upstate New York. He did his PhD at the University of New Hampshire. He's the director of the forestry program, and he's also involved with sustainable agriculture education at the college. He's active in the New York and New England chapters of the Society of American Foresters, and he's chair of the National Agroforestry Working Group for SAF. Joe's research focus is on northeastern U.S. silvopastures. He's a strong believer in applied research, and his academic work in silvopastures partially integrated into North Branch Farm, a unique livestock, fruit, and vegetable farm he owns and operates in Saranac, New York. And you'll find the website link to that farm in the PowerPoint presentation today. That's adkfigs.com. His most recent work has been to document silvopasture systems on farms across New York and New England. So today's presentation, Silvopasture in the Northeast United States with Joe Orefice. So, Joe?
Great. Thank you, Greg, for the introduction. If Greg can hear
All
me,
right. Thanks.
Greg,
So
type
I'm
in.
my mic now, and Joe will take over.
Sure. And if any of the participants, if you cannot hear me, please let me know in the chat box. But I'm going to go on the assumption that folks can hear me since we could all hear Greg so clearly. First, I want to thank Greg for inviting me to participate in this webinar and to offer this webinar. I'm really looking forward to getting feedback from everybody who's involved. And a quick thing, the overall about me there is I research silvopasture and I also practice it. And most of this presentation will be based on some research that was part of my PhD program at the University of New Hampshire. But you'll see a few other things from the farm and obviously practicing my academic field is something. It definitely leads to some of the questions that I was looking to answer. So we'll move through this PowerPoint and hopefully have some great questions at the end. A quick outline here. I'm going to go over a rationale on why even consider silvopasture. Why in the Northeast it's a fairly new place to talk about silvopasture, and why it's needed, why research like this is needed, and why practitioners are needed. I'm going to talk about regional silvopasture practices. These I documented on regional farms in the Northeast. I'm going to talk about the perspectives of those practitioners. So what those practitioners, why they practice it, what they view it as, some of the challenges they have, how they manage a little bit, and then just some conclusions to wrap up today. First off, I like to thank my research supporters right up front at the beginning. They're very important to be able to have folks supporting research like this, especially something in silvopasture in a place where it's not well understood. To have organizations support it was very beneficial. So the research you're going to see in this presentation was primarily supported financially by the Northeastern States Research Cooperative, and they were spectacular to work with, and I really can't say enough good things about them. University of New Hampshire, of course, where I was working on the PhD, and my colleagues there and my professors there, while at University of New Hampshire, participated quite a bit in this research, specifically my advisor, John Carroll, who was involved with it in every step. And then Paul Smith College, who also was very supportive and helpful in this work. That's my employer, current employer, and employer at the time. So first, just a quick background on Silvopasture. One of the tough things about a webinar is I don't know everybody's background who's a participant, and I can't really poll you all with any sort of time efficiency. So we're just going to go over a quick Silvopasture idea here, and I'll use my pointer. And notice Silvopasture in the middle here. It's one of the 5 main agroforestry practices that are
Is the sound back on? Are we having troubles with the sound today? Joe, it
Can you
seems
hear me all right?
we lost sound.
Can you hear me now, Greg?
I can hear you now, yes. Everyone can hear you? All right.
Great.
How
I
about
apologize for that, folks.
Yeah, why don't we back up a slide and take it again from there, all right?
Sure, yeah. So, sorry about that. I think my internet connection here bounced. I'm not sure why. Perhaps it's living in the boondocks.
It may have been a lapse on our end, so I'll monitor the connection and the audio from here. Thanks.
Sure, we'll chalk it up as a glitch. Hopefully, we won't get any more. But the research supporters here, like I was saying, Northeastern States Research Cooperative, incredibly supportive. University of New Hampshire, where I was working on my PhD program, very supportive. John Carroll, my advisor there, every step of the way. And then my employer, Paul Smith College, who also helped me with this research quite a bit. So as I was just saying, silvopasture, and you may or may not have heard, silvopasture is one of the main agroforestry practices in North America. It's actually the most common one practiced in North America, although it's not that common in the Northeast. The key basis behind silvopasture is that you're producing livestock and trees on the same unit of land. So you're actually trying to produce trees and livestock. It's not just the livestock happen to be with trees type of thing. And to produce livestock, you typically need some type of forage. And so that's the third component of silvopasture that's often recognized. A lot of benefits to silvopasture that have been discussed in previous literature. Reduced heat and cold stress on livestock, very, very important. Heat, obviously, stress reduced through shade, and cold stress reduced primarily through wind reduction. Multiple use, multiple revenue. You're producing a tree crop here, so trees are making money in some way, as are your livestock. Forages produced under shade typically are higher quality, and under trees are often higher quality. Quantity may be variable, but quality is often higher. There's a summer slump forage availability. So silvopastures have been shown to have green forage under them in the summer when open pastures, treeless pastures, may have burned off due to the summer heat. There's an incentive to manage farm woodland. In the Northeast especially, there's quite a bit of farm woodland out there that's unmanaged, and this is a way of integrating farm primary products, such as livestock, with woodlands. Vegetation management is something that has a lot of interest, but not a lot of research into it. And how can we use livestock to actually manage unwanted vegetation or encourage certain types of vegetation? And these aren't always silvopasture applications, but there's very much applications for vegetation management within silvopastures, and oftentimes vegetation management is necessary in a silvopasture. And then, this last one, I just can't stress enough, aesthetics. Silvopastures, when done well, look great, and people like that, and people like their farms to look well, and people like where their food is coming from to look like a healthy and desirable place to be. And while that may not seem all that quantitative, it's very important and shouldn't be ignored. There are challenges with silvopasture. It is not a system that can work with continuous grazing. Much like normal pasture systems that don't work with continuous grazing, silvopastures don't work as well. Trees are not comfortable with long-term stresses from livestock. It requires knowledge of three things: livestock, trees, and pasture management, which many people don't have all three. So oftentimes there's a need for collaboration between somebody who knows about trees, think foresters, somebody who knows about livestock, think farmers, and folks who know about pasture management, think farmers and extension professionals. It is a slow process to establish. Farmers are used to just flipping things. If I plant corn in the spring, I'm going to have corn in the summer or in the fall. If I plant trees in the spring, I'm going to have trees ready to harvest maybe in 30 years, maybe longer, depending on where you are. Tree regeneration is periodic. This is something that we need to think about in silvopastures. We need to have planned regeneration periods. And plants in silvopastures are different than open pastures. Now you have woody plants, you have trees. We need to understand the toxicities or just the toxic levels, and also just the nutritional value of silvopastures. So these are things to consider. It doesn't mean the practice doesn't work, but it means that these need to be taken into account. I always put a slide in whenever I talk about silvopasture about what it is not, because there's a lot of confusion around it. It is not unmanaged pastured woodlands. I used to call these grazed woodlands. I don't call them grazed anymore because there is nothing to graze in here. It is just pastured woodlands with nothing to graze, not a desirable system, and it's not silvopasture. It's not livestock eating brush. This one's actually from my farm. By the way, all the photos you see in here from here on out in this presentation are from farms in New York and New England. But this one here is from my farm, and I'm actually using my cattle to manage woody vegetation to create an open pasture. It's not silvopasture, it's just using livestock to eat brush. And then these bottom ones these are wolf trees in open fields, so think lone wolf. It's just a single tree in a field. There's no real production goal for this tree. There's probably some root compaction around the base, which is leading to this thin crown, because livestock are likely concentrating under this tree because it's their only area of shade. Remember, silvopasture has that intentional tree production component. And there's some real problems with these unmanaged pastured woodlands, and these are pretty common in the Northeast. You get root compaction. This is from a farm. This photo you see here is actually from a farm that I visited as part of my work, who self-identified as practicing silvopasture, and this was one of their self-identified silvopastures. It's not something I would define as a silvopasture in any way, because you have quite a bit of tree mortality and root damage and all these other problems: compaction, girdling from livestock, soil degradation. I mean, you get parasite problems in your life. All the problems that you would get in leaving livestock in a forageless open pasture, you get with putting livestock in the woods in an unmanaged system. Yet this pastured woodlands concept is something that I think is really important to think about, because it's very common in the Northeast. These data that you see here in this table, or the data that are behind this table, are from the 2012 U.S. Census of Agriculture. And if we look at woodland pasture, so this is woodland pasture identified by farms, and it's a census, so it includes most all the farms. In the region of New York and New England, there are over 250,000 acres of woodland pasture. So pasture that farmers are identifying as being covered in trees. Over 10,000 farms are using this type of pasture. It makes up 17% of the total acreage of pasture land in the Northeast, in New York and New England. 17%. So for some states, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, for every 5 acres of pasture land, there's 1 acre of pasture land. 1 acre of that 5 acres is actually dominated by trees. It's covered in trees. So there's quite a bit of livestock in woodlands in this region. And the question is, Is it poorly managed pastured woodlands, or is it intentionally well-managed silvopasture? Most commonly, it's poorly managed pastured woodlands. And so my argument that I often make is, can we take this need for integrating livestock with trees, or this desire for integrating livestock with trees, and make it into a sustainable, productive, environmentally friendly system, which would be silvopasture. And this is really the basis behind my approach to silvopasture and why I incorporate it as part of my career. This photo here is from Watkins Glen, New York, Angus Glen Farm, owned and managed by Brett Chedzoy, who is probably the regional expert in silvopasture, in the Northeast. So Brett is one to think about, and I'll give you a link to a blog site at the end that Brett set up. But this is a problem. This poorly managed pastured woodland is a problem, and we can't ignore it because it hasn't gone away and it won't go away. What I feel is we should make some management recommendations so folks can do silvopasture as opposed to a fairly destructive system. So my research investigated silvopasture in New York and New England. I purposefully sampled 20 farms. So this wasn't a random sample of farms in the region. This was intentionally trying to find practitioners of silvopasture who were doing it well. And the way this research worked is practitioners were interviewed for their perspectives and also their management style and techniques. And their silvopasture systems were actually physically inventoried. So quantified forages, forage types, species, and tree species, and with interviews we were able to discuss livestock incorporation. This photo here in this slide is a apple orchard silvopasture, wild apples, but managed, thinned out on my farm in Riverview, being grazed with cattle. So what did I find? What did we look at for farms? Well, on these 20 farms in New York and New England, I categorized the silvopasture into these following types. 13 of the farms had been converting forest, so closed canopy forest, to uniformly spaced silvopastures, so thinning out existing forests to make a silvopasture. 7 farms were converting open field edges. And by the way, you'll notice these numbers don't add up to 20. It's because some farms were doing multiple. Some farms had tree spacing and orchards and open field edges, etc. But these open field edges, they had an open hay field where the edges had encroached over the years from things like limbs falling in. And the farmers were finding ways to optimize that by creating silvopastures along the edges of an open hay field, which was also used as pasture, and sometimes just used as pasture. Orchards, so orchards being grazed with livestock, 6 farms, and outdoor living barns I'll speak about, but quite a diversity of operations here, including some plantations, and even a sugar bush was being utilized. We'll talk more about that. Overall, systems are incredibly innovative. There's a lot of different practices that are out there to try to regenerate trees. You see individual tree protection here to regenerate a maple in a silvopasture, or in the edge of a silvopasture. You can't see the rest of the silvopasture in the photo. Living trees being used as fences, and this is a batten board, where as the tree grows, it'll push out the batten board, and that's allowing a high tensile fence to be used on a living tree. It also allows that fence to slide in that insulator, so as that tree sways in the wind, it doesn't rip your fence out. That being said, you also want to make sure that the trees which are using this aren't saw timber quality. And there are products out there that allow you to use saw timber quality trees without having to put any nails in them. This is a system of not quite silvopasture, I'm not sure what you'd call it, but it's high bush blueberry, which is periodically grazed with sheep in between the rows. Again, a high tensile fence system. You notice the compression springs here. This helps your high tensile fence flex when the trees sway. And this is what we were titled very scientifically as a stump dragger. And the farmer who utilizes this, he'll drag his forest conversions to silvopastures about 6 to 8 years later, when the stumps have decayed and flip the stumps up with this piece of equipment that he drags behind a bulldozer. So instead of stumping the land right away, which causes, risks a lot of soil erosion, can really do some damage to your residual tree roots, this system allows you to pull stumps after about 8 years when they've decayed enough that they come up pretty easily. So again, a slow process to establish, but pretty innovative. At this point in the presentation, I'm gonna go through some different practices and show you what they look like, show you their years since establishment, approximate. Most are pretty close, but some were estimates by the farmer. And this is a oak stand that was converted from a silvopasture, or converted to a silvopasture from a closed canopy forest about 2 years prior to this photo. And you can see on the top left hand of your screen what the forages looked like. There was quite a bit of white clover and some perennial ryegrass and some other common cool season grasses in this silvopasture. Do take note that these oak trees have quite a bit of epicormic branching. That's likely due to stresses from timber harvesting and opening that forest up quite a bit. There's not a lot of residual tree density in this stand. This is the same farm but a different stand in year 1, and so it's a pretty good representation of what that previous slide looked like the year before. And so quite a bit of change just even visually there. Notice the epicormic branches have not expressed themselves on these oaks yet. Forest conversion to group tree spacing. So this was an opportunity that some farmers took advantage of, where they had groups of nice trees. So you have groups here, so groups. They left the trees, and this helps. It can help prevent epicormic branching because you get the shade from the residual trees on each other, and you also don't disturb as much in between or on each tree. This is about year 15 to 20 since establishment. And the farmer had been seeding some cool season forages in here. And one thing to note from this slide is the persistence of hay-scented fern. This photo is from Maine. The previous photos were from Massachusetts. But hay-scented fern, even 15 to 20 years later, has persisted, which is an undesirable plant. Here's one from western New York. This is a ash silvopasture, and this is variable tree spacing. So the farmer took a forest, closed canopy forest, left denser groups, left single trees, and then also left open areas. And so is it a uniform silvopasture? Well, not in any way. But does it work for this farm? He seems to be pretty happy with it. And this is 25 to 30 years post-establishment. So these ash trees were just saplings when this was created. Another forest conversion here to variable tree spacing, and you see the residual trees here, obviously highly variable in the distribution. And this is less than 5 years old, and the understory was pretty thick prior, from what I understand from the farmer, with invasive shrubs. And forest mulching was the strategy here, and then a continuously grazed rotational grazing system. So continuous in the sense of every year livestock being put in for a short period of time to intensively graze and then removed, and allowing grasses to recover. And that gradually reduced the amount of shrub. This next slide here is an open pasture edge. So as I mentioned earlier, you have an open pasture on the left, and on the right you have the edge that was reclaimed, essentially. The crop trees were selected, and residual trees were left to grow as, in this case, timber was the output. Here's another timber silvopasture. This is where the view here is we're standing in the open pasture looking into the silvopasture. This is white pine with a couple scattered red pine. And this is a cattle pasture where the density of trees gradually gets denser as you go towards the back, as you go towards the forest edge. And the farmer intentionally did this so that way along this forest edge there's a lot more shade and less understory plants, so they don't have as much shorting out of their high tensile fence. So it's kind of an innovative way to use shade. And this is year 2 post-establishment. Here's a black walnut plantation in New York. This is uniform plantation. Orchard grass is your primary forage underneath. And this was really high density. It's at a relative density of about 100%, and which is really dense. Those who don't know relative density, it's dense. And if you look up in the canopy of this is a shot from the canopy where I'm standing when I took the photo. You notice that it's pretty full crown closure, and yet we still have forages underneath. In part, this is due to the light transmission of black walnut foliage. It allows a lot of light through its crown, and that helps get forages underneath. So tree species does play a big role in what you can grow underneath it. This plantation is for timber, hence the density. This is another plantation from a different farm in New York. This is from Brett Chedzoy's farm down in Watkins Glen. This is a black locust plantation with enrichment planting of black walnut. So black walnut for timber production and black locust for fence post production. And this had already seen 2 commercial thinnings. No, sorry, I apologize. 1 commercial thinning in the 20 years prior to this photo taken. And that thinning was commercial because fence posts were yielded. So this is quite a bit of quite a nice benefit in a silvopasture. If you can plant trees, and the sooner you can make money off them, the more likely it is it'll be a worthwhile investment. Orchard silvopasture. So here's an example from Rhode Island where an orchard, production orchard, was being grazed periodically with a flock of sheep. And that's really important in orchards, is the height of your animal. The browse height is really what's going to determine how low you can allow your fruit trees to grow. So with sheep, you can allow them to grow a lot lower than with cattle. And again, this is a system where sheep are in here for a very short period of time, 1 day. In this farm, that's what they were using for rotations, 1 day, and then removed for about 30 days before being allowed back in. This is another orchard system. So this is an apple orchard in New York. And you can see after 20 years of rotational grazing that the orchard is, while the farmer is no longer using it as a commercial orchard, the farmer does want to maintain it as an open and somewhat productive system for his farm, and therefore he's grazing livestock in there and actually doing them on a fairly nice short rotational grazing schedule, about 2 to 3 days per paddock. Again, going to a certain forage height, which is the standard in rotational grazing. And this is the same orchard. This property had actually been split into 2 parcels. This is the same orchard on a different parcel that had been abandoned, and this is 20 years of abandonment. And what's hard to see from this photo is that most of this understory and brush is actually multiflora rose. Oriental bittersweet is in here, and then there are also some ash trees growing up and taking over this land. So silvopasture in this case has actually maintained the land in a productive state, whereas in this case there's going to be a lot of input if you wanted to make this orchard or land productive agriculturally again. Outdoor living barns are sort of the silvopasture that doesn't quite fit with the definition. These are dense areas of trees used to provide shelter to livestock, and these were being used on farms in New England. This farm in particular kept this outdoor living barn of balsam fir and bordered by white pine, hence aesthetics of being the white pine. Used this silvopasture as a place of fly relief for livestock in the summer, and so this is just an image of horn flies. And so livestock could go in this area to get fly relief in the summer. Now, outdoor living barns are also used for the purpose of winter shelter. And I think about the easiest comparison to an outdoor living barn is a deer yard for white-tailed deer, where they can coop up in the wintertime. And the thing to note about outdoor living barns is there's not much forage or any forage that grows underneath your canopy because it's so dense. So you really need to be careful that livestock are not in there during periods of the year when the soils are wet, and not in there for too long, because compaction, without that forage layer, compaction can occur really quickly. And with wet soils, you can do a lot of damage to your tree roots. So outdoor living barns are a useful thing, but they need to be managed appropriately. This is a silvopastured sugar bush. You see the lines here. So sugar bush is where we tap trees in the Northeast, and we take their sap, we drain it downhill, we boil it down, and we make maple syrup. And this farm, in most farmers who have sugar bushes don't like an understory. They'll do an understory when they're regenerating, but they don't want an understory while they're sugaring because it gets in the way of running their lines and tapping to each tree. They have to move to each tree and check the lines, and so they don't want an understory. So this farmer is actually using cattle when the ground is dry to keep that understory down because his forest is young enough now that he doesn't need to regenerate. The success of a sugar bush, I'm not trying to promote this system. I'm not trying to promote any of these systems. I'm just trying to show folks what I've documented. The success of the system is really dependent on not compacting your maple roots. And that's really dependent on being a great livestock manager and watching your soil moisture and timing. And then the thing about pigs, and I can't stress this point enough. So if you're zoning off and doing something else on your computer right now, pay attention, because the thing about pigs is we got to talk about it. Folks in the Northeast are not pasturing pigs very sustainably at all. Many are calling it silvopasture. In fact, this farmer was calling this a silvopasture, and as you can just see clearly with root exposure, you see if you look close and get X-ray vision, you can almost see the girdling around the base of these hardwoods. You can see mud, no forage whatsoever. In the Northeast, we're great at growing rocks, especially when we don't have roots to keep them down. So now rocks are coming to the surface, and pigs are obviously rooting up those rocks. They're rooting up these trees, and this is a system that not only isn't good for the pigs, it is not good for the trees, it's not good for the soil, it's not good for surface runoff, it's not good for nutrient retention. It's a poorly designed system, and it is not sustainable in the long term. But this is occurring quite a bit in the region. And actually, if you hashtag silvopasture on something like Instagram or Facebook, you'll see images like this come up from all over the country that people are calling silvopasture, or they're calling it forest-raised pork. And to me, as a practitioner of silvopasture, it's kind of insulting. And to me, as a researcher and a professional in the field, it's very concerning. And if we don't address it, I think it's going to continue to happen and continue to build. And I think it's possible to be raising pigs in a sustainable silvopasture. We can see that in other parts of the world, but folks are not doing it well here. What folks are primarily doing is they're using pigs for rooting and grubbing, which means pigs are rooting for roots. What are they eating? Your tree's roots. Trees cannot handle that. So this is a practice that really needs to be taken on, and we need some real management recommendations. If we go to other parts of the world, we go to Europe, we look at how trees are pastured in silvopastures in Europe. They're actually used for things like masting. And so they're put into the forest only when there's mast on the ground. Mast being nuts, acorns. So pigs, instead of eating roots, they get to eat acorns, which is more desirable. So instead of rooting, they're eating the acorns, which is why they're put in when the acorns are on the ground. So it's a real difference between using pigs for rooting and using pigs for masting. It is not the same thing, and to trees it's really not. It's not worthwhile. I put this image up because this is the same farm. This is not a property boundary here, but this is a paddock boundary. Pigs on the left, cattle pasture on the right. Notice the forage in the cattle pasture. The farmer is taking a lot of interest in making sure that the cattle have grasses to grow. And I think the reason I see a lot of pigs being pastured like this is pigs are typically in this region being fed grains. So the pig is being brought nutrients to it, brought energy to it. So that's what the farmer's relying on no matter what. So it doesn't matter if there's not much grass in here because most of that pig's energy is coming from grain that's brought. Whereas on the right-hand side, with grass-fed beef, which is the case on this farm and in many farms around the region, the feed is actually being grown on the land. And so if the farmer destroys all their pasture over here, suddenly they have an extra cost of buying hay to feed their animals. Whereas that cost for feeding your pigs is always there. So I think that's part of what's going on. And I also think there's a real misunderstanding between whether or not trees with root damage like this and root damage like this can actually recover. I think a lot of farmers don't notice that their trees are suffering because trees take about 5 years to die from root damage. They'll live off their reserves in their trunk and the larger roots for about 5 years, and then you'll see them die out. And so as this practice of pig rooting continues, I think we're going to see a lot more forests suffering from it when they really don't have to, if we can use pigs for something like masting as opposed to rooting. So I'll get off my soapbox on that one right now, but I really wanted to stress that point. These are some of the characteristics of silvopastures around, and table 5 here from a paper that's in the works right now, trying to get published, is shows the tree species groups, the common ones. And again, these farms were using multiple silvopastures, so the numbers won't add up to 20. But you see oaks were common, maples were common, fruit trees were common as desirable species in or not desirable, species that existed in silvopastures. Eastern white pine, very common. And then goals for trees in silvopastures. Farmers were raising their trees in their silvopastures for saw timber, firewood, and fruit or nuts. Those were the primary potential. Some farmers wanted maple sugar. Only one of them was actually doing it. But that's what's out there. Fence posts, those were black locust and northern white cedar. Forages that I found in these silvopastures, common ones: red clover, white clover, orchard grass. Some of the bent grasses are native Agroforestry species. Bluegrasses, most of those are native bluegrasses. Fescues were around. Many native fescues and undesirable ones, not all tall fescue, but things like meadow fescue and sheep fescue. And then timothy was also common. So that's what was existing in these silvopastures. Plenty of sedges being found for these non-woody plants: brambles, rubus, raspberries, things like that, dandelion. And then farmers were actively managing for your legumes: red clover, white clover, timothy, orchard grass, rye grasses. And many farmers also wanted diversified woody browse. And they wanted their animals to be having a diversified diet, and part of that was woody browse. Some farmers were going for that. Undesirable plants that farmers identified in their silvopastures, so things that they did not want there that were there: multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, knotweed, bittersweet, buckthorn. Notice these are primarily invasive alien shrubs. Of course, thistles in there, that's not one. Sedges were in there, most of those are native. Mountain laurel, that's a native one, but it's still a woody shrub that can be difficult to deal with. Also toxic to livestock. And then numerous species of ferns. And so these are things that farmers did not want, that they thought got in the way of their forage production or possibly were hazards to their livestock. So why were these farmers practicing silvopasture? 16 of them, they gave them a number of reasons. So again, they don't add up to 20, but 16 out of 20 were using silvopastures as shade for their livestock. Many wanted to expand their pasture acreage and the diversity of their pastures, so not just have one type of pasture, but have multiple options on their farm for different periods. They wanted to increase the utilization of their farmland. I mentioned this earlier. How can we maximize the use of farmland? We have a lot of woodland on our farms, and can we put it to a use that's more tied into our current product line? Many farmers use silvopasture to increase the forage availability during midsummer and drought. So this is a reason they were using silvopasture, because they perceived that they had more forage available in the midsummer and droughts. And I think this is an area where we could do a lot more research, and I know some folks in the Midwest and the Appalachians are working on this in the South, because there seems to be potential there. It doesn't mean it's actually happening in the Northeast, but farmers are stating it as a reason for why they're using silvopasture. Diversified diet, animal welfare, all these play a role. And aesthetics. Challenges of silvopasture utilization: fencing establishment and maintenance. That was a big one. Farmers wanted to know the best way and the cheapest way and the most effective way to keep their animals into these silvopastures. A huge lack of knowledge towards silvopasture management. Farmers wanted to know how to do this. Lack of time. Some farmers got into silvopasture and they said, I just really don't have time to manage these three complexities: the trees, livestock, and forages. I only have time for the livestock. I only have time for the forages and livestock. So that's a challenge and something to think about for folks who might be getting into silvopasture. And then a lot of unknowns here and a few others. So this slide is just one that stresses that desire to increase utilization of farm woodland. And you notice this farm, this is from a farm in Massachusetts, has a number of open pastures which serve as pastures and hayfields. And they have this area, which is not a drainage, it's actually an upland, of oak and pine, primarily oak, that they want to utilize as a pasture. And so they intend to convert this forest land, which is now just growing trees, to a place where they can grow trees for timber and graze their livestock. And this way, when their livestock are in an open pasture here, and an open pasture here, and an open pasture down here, they can have options of paddocks with shade. So let's say they get a 3-day stretch in the midsummer, and it's going to be a nice hay stretch, and it's going to be sunshine, and their animals are in an open pasture. Now they can put them into a shaded pasture for 3 days. And then maybe when it gets cool again or the clouds come by, they can put them back into an open pasture. And so that's just one example of how a farm may look at the spatially utilizing their woodland. What did farmers want to see? This is, areas of research they requested, so kind of areas of knowledge they want to see. They want to know about forage browse, quality, selection management. What's going on with the forages? They want to know that. Tree care, how do we do it? Regeneration is a big question. What are the best ways to regenerate trees in silvopastures? Planting seems like something that may really come out there as the one to do. But then do you fence individual trees? Do you fence rows of trees? How do you do it? And folks are working on this, and I think we could do some more on it. Overall silvopasture management, the question, soil properties. Farmers who were pasturing pigs poorly, they weren't doing it and not caring about the situation. They wanted to know what the best practices were. They just didn't have any resources to tell them. Vegetation management, fencing, quite a bit here. And of course, the last one, which is in no way the least one, is the economics. Does it pay? How much does it pay? When's it going to pay? That's all something that needs to be figured out. Property taxes, if it's silvopasture, is it a woodland property tax or is it a farmland property tax? This changes by state. And then conclusions here. A confusion exists in the region between pasturing, woodland, and silvopasture. Folks don't know for sure what silvopasture is, and there's a lot of folks out there calling things silvopasture that are not silvopasture, and that's a real concern if we want to maintain silvopasture as a truly sustainable and environmentally beneficial practice. Silvopasture systems in the Northeast, they're diverse. There's a lot going on. We have diverse forest, we have a diverse landscape, and I think that leads to this diversity in silvopasture systems. We also have pretty diverse farm products. Farmers practicing silvopasture, despite sparsely available information. I mean, this is a point to take home. Farmers are putting in silvopastures whether they know how to do it or not, and they want to know how to do it, but we need to help them with that. Any future research, really, we need to look at the functional mechanisms of trees, forage, livestock, moisture dynamics, light. This is a question that comes up pretty much every other week. Somebody sends me an email on it. What residual tree density should I leave in a silvopasture if I'm converting a forest to a silvopasture? And we just really don't know. There's rules of thumb. Folks say, well, half the basal area, half the density. But what are you starting with? What are the species? Think back to that black walnut image I showed you, which was incredibly dense, but because black walnut allows a lot of light transmission through its canopy, it was functioning in that specific farm. And then, we need long-term studies to address the productivity, economics, ecological implications of silvopasture. We don't know these, and we really need to have some long-term studies in the region. And some are going on. There's a new one at University of New Hampshire that started up on addressing some of these ecological implications in the long term of silvopasture. So this is my last slide here, and then we'll open it up to questions. But I want to encourage you all to check out silvopasture.ning.com, and there's a couple references from some of the citations in the PowerPoint. But silvopasture.ning.com, this is a blog that Brett Chedzoy and Peter Smallage from Cornell Cooperative Extension set up. And again, Brett is a practitioner in Watkins Glen, New York, of silvopasture. And so they set this up as a place where folks can go and network and post questions and hear events. And and all this, and it's a real useful thing. So let's say somebody's going to be putting in a silvopasture, and they want to say, well, what should I do? Well, take a couple photos, post it on this blog, and you'll get some real expert advice. I give Brett and Peter a lot of credit. They're very active on this, and it's a worthwhile thing to check out. So thanks everybody for listening and being a part of this webinar. At
Yes,
this point,
thank you.
We can open up to some
thank
questions.
you, Joe. I'm gonna just open up a question box here, and folks should be able to write in their questions. Yeah, I think you'll find a dialog box for participants. You'll see a dialog box down at the bottom of the Q&A. So if you would just go ahead and send any questions you might have. In the meantime, I'd like to thank Joe, and I might want to explore a bit more. I guess I'm glad that you mentioned, Joe, the question of regeneration, and certainly it appears to be one of the top areas of question, or as you cited, as a need for research, and it certainly is something we've struggled here with in Missouri, or been focused on the researches. That is a challenge in a silvopasture system is the long-term regeneration, especially here in Missouri, in the Ozarks, and some of the oak regeneration in also. Oh well. So until we get any questions, well, let's see. Well, we have a question from Rick Shock. Let's go ahead with that question, Joe. Can you see that on your screen?
We got one here. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I can. But before we do that, Greg, I just want to mention one thing about regeneration before we get too far off that topic. One thing we often forget about with regenerating silvopastures is that maybe there's a period of time while we're regenerating it when it's not a silvopasture too. That's another option. Is you say, well, for 10 years until the trees get big enough, whether they're planted or natural regeneration, we don't include livestock and let them regenerate, and then we make it a silvopasture again. Silvopasture doesn't have to be a permanent thing on the landscape. It can be something for a period of time. I just wanted to point that out because it's an interesting concept, and some of the farms that I was visiting were looking at it in that way. But Rich's question here, it says, would you please discuss grazing rates like on your farm? And this is Rich, thanks for the hardest question. This is one that's really tough because, for example, on my farm, my grazing rates really change based on my forage composition. So some of my native agrostis grasses, things like red top, I might get one graze out of it over the season, and so think on a 2-acre paddock, think maybe 20 head of beef cattle for, I don't know, 3 days. They might eat that red top down if it's in June or July, but then I won't get another graze of that for the rest of the season. Whereas on an orchard grass, white clover, you could think the same stocking rates, but I may be able to graze it 3 or 4 times between May and October. And where I am, that's the grazing season because the snow usually goes away around the last week of April, and we've already had snow on the ground up here last week. So it's gone again, but that's a tough question. It depends on soil fertility. It definitely depends on species composition, and it can really depend on the rainfall over the course of a year. So I don't think about it as rates. I think more about forage productivity. When the forage is about 6 to 8 inches high, graze it. When they graze it down to about 3 inches high, move them, and then let it grow back to about 6 inches high before you graze it again. And so that's really how I think about grazing rates, and it really changes farm to farm, and even within a farm, especially within a farm, it changes pasture to pasture. So I apologize for dodging that question some, but it's a really tough one to raise. When I think about impact on the land, I think about it in terms of don't have livestock in a spot for more than 5 days, 7 days at a maximum. If the ground's frozen, maybe a little different, but if you're doing outfeeding in the winter, but really that 3 to 5 days, any more than that, and you're probably going to start doing some real compaction to your tree roots.
Well, go ahead, Joe.
I'm going to move on to the next question.
I was just going to make a comment, and you
that work?
Pretty much addressing that. It's very much, it depends. paradigm and driven by the actual conditions and just focusing on the conditions of your pasture. And of course, that's going to vary not only farm to farm, of course, region to region. And for those listening outside the Northeast region, of course, going to have very different conditions. But go ahead, Joe. The next question there with Wolfgang's questions.
Sure. Yeah. One other thing I'll put in there, because this comes up a lot, is what's the difference between the silvopasture production and the open pasture production? And I use both of those on my farm. Many of the farms I visited, actually all the farms I visited, used both open pastures and silvopastures. I've measured it on my farm in certain cases, and I say I feel fairly comfortable saying my silvopastures produce 2/3 to 100% of what my open pastures produce. That's on the assumption of similar soil type. It's actually a true silvopasture, so the trees have been thinned out, and in similar composition of forages. But that's what I figured, 2/3 to about 100% of what my open pasture will do. And I have variable density silvopastures, so that's why there's a lot of variability. Laura's question here, could you explain the step-by-step process that people are using to establish these silvopastures? When do you clear and seed? How long do you wait until you
sorry about that there, Joe.
send animals through the first time? No, it's okay. I just needed to click on it. Any good rule of thumb? Again, I'm going to dodge your question here. Dusty Walter, I saw a presentation he did from the University of Missouri there one time, and he said, every answer to every question about silvopastures, it depends.
Yep.
And I think you guys in Missouri use that a lot. This is one where I'm going to take a note. It depends. You obviously want to clear, if you're going to be thinning trees, you want to do it when the trees are dormant, ideally, because it's going to do less damage to them. You can do it during the growing season, but if your soils are wet, you want to watch out. In terms of what is the density, the rule of thumb everybody's using for trees is 50% of the basal area. It seems to be what everybody's using, but it doesn't come from anywhere other than 50 is half of 100. And it seems to also be working a little bit. So there's definitely a range, but that's where that is. Seeding, my suggestion is you seed as soon after you clear as possible. It's all about competition. If you can get the desirable forages growing before the other stuff volunteers to grow, you're better off. Now, one thing you got to watch out for is what's already there in terms of advance regeneration. What's there in advance of you clearing that site? And if there's a bunch of shrubby brush, things like Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, if you don't address that, it's going to either persist or it's going to sprout back. And so that's where herbicide comes in, or some really intensive things. And there's a few options, but I would say seed as soon as you can to get some competition going from your desirable species. Grasses want bare mineral soil to germinate in, and if you let it go a year or two, you're going to have it filled with a bunch of grasses or sedges or woody shrubs that you don't necessarily want. How long do you wait till you send animals through the first time? Think about it in terms of your forage health. If your forage is ready to be grazed, you can graze it. But if your forage doesn't have its root system established well, and you put livestock in there, they're going to do some damage to those forages. In terms of my systems, when I did it, I put my livestock through while I was seeding, so they trampled it in. And then I waited a year, let the forages grow up, and then so I seeded in August, and then the following July, actually it was the following August, I grazed it. And so I didn't graze it while those forages were young. So always think about your forage height. If your forage is 6 to 8 inches tall or taller, it's probably fairly well established, regardless of the species. I mean, there's different species. There's a lot of caveats, but if it's tall, it's probably established, and you can graze it. But you also need to think about all those other plants. If you're trying to use livestock for vegetation management, if you want them to eat some of the, let's say, aspen sprouts, you need to get them in there to eat those aspen sprouts, and you want to defoliate those woody plants 2 to 3 times a year. It's all about competition. Woody plants don't like to be defoliated 2 to 3 times during a growing season. Grasses can handle that, and they can come back. And so by defoliating your woody plants and eating your grasses, you're giving your grasses a competitive advantage because your grasses are able to respond when your woody plants aren't able to respond as well. That's my answer to that question, Laura. If you want me to expand, feel free to post again. I'm going to approach Brent's question here. Are there regulations surrounding production of apples or other fruits grown from trees within silvopasture systems as far as food safety is concerned? Brent, great question. The Food Safety and Modernization Act is incredibly scary to me in terms of this regulation. I haven't seen the latest one or wherever it ended up yet, but I know in the planning stages there was one where you weren't allowed to graze, you weren't allowed to put manure on crops that would be harvested within, I think it was 6 to 9 months of that manure application. And there were some regulations based on farm size and income amount, where some farms over a certain income weren't allowed to do it at all. Farms on a lower income were allowed to do it, but they had to record every manure application. And if you think about a silvopasture, animals apply manure quite a bit on their own accord, and so recording that would be pretty challenging and unpleasant. And there's a real question there of, is it a food safety concern? When I did look into this, I did inquire about this, and I did do a little more investigation. And the concern was that workers who were picking fruit, such as picking apples, climbing a ladder, could step in manure, climb the rung of the ladder, climb down the ladder, get their hand on the manure from their shoe, and then get that on the fruit, and that would be a food safety concern. That was the response that I saw as to why that regulation was in there. I don't know where it ended up. Honestly, I think it's, personally, as a farmer, I feel it's a little absurd, but it's out there and we can't ignore it. Now, organic farmers have a real concern, because organic farmers have I think, 120 or 90 day, and I believe it's 90 day withdrawal or hold off period between applying raw manure and harvesting a crop. And so if you're an organic farmer and you have a silvopasture, which is an orchard silvopasture, you're, by organic standards, not allowed to have manure applied, even direct from the animal, in your orchard silvopastures, in your orchards, within 90 days of harvesting. So if you were harvesting in September, you could not graze that area between June and September. So organic, there already is a standard there. None of these were developed because of silvopastures. These were developed because of applications of manure mechanically in orchards, but silvopastures do fall into it. Laura has a follow-up question here. Do most silvopasture practitioners do something with leaf litter to prevent it from smothering their grasses? Laura, I'm going to just answer that and say no. I don't know of any silvopasture practitioners that are actually addressing leaf litter smothering their grasses. I remember when I first started practicing silvopasture, I saw this happening, and I said, oh no, this isn't good. Leaves falling in the fall, grasses coming up in the spring. I've never had an issue with it. The grasses actually come right through it. Because of the low density of your trees compared to a closed canopy forest, there's not as many leaves. And what I've seen, observed as a farmer, not as a researcher, but as a farmer, what I've observed is my forages tend to push up through those leaves without a problem in the springtime. And being hardwood leaves, they tend to break down pretty quick. And needles, grasses are able to push up through pretty well. Where you might consider leaf litter is needles falling and actually acidifying the soil in a conifer situation. And that may or may not be a problem, but it's something I would think about. Dig's question here: do pig nose rings help with tree rooting problems? I've never used, Dig, I've never used a pig nose ring. I mean, the intention is that the pig can't root with a nose ring, so if it prevents them from rooting, it would help prevent tree rooting problems. So anything you can do to keep your pigs from rooting, I think, would help. But I don't have any experience with pig nose rings. I know in my region in the Northeast, outdoor animals in the wintertime, in even cold periods. Nose rings can be dangerous because they'll freeze and you'll get a real bad frostbite problem in the nose. So up here in northern New York, I don't see many nose rings going on, but possibly that would work. Yeah. The key with pigs is, one thing that helps with tree rooting and rooting with pigs is moving them quickly. Many folks, I didn't mention in this presentation, but many folks who are pasturing pigs would move their pigs once a month, once a season, once a year. And those same farmers would move their cattle or their sheep every day. And so there was a question there of just stocking. I mean, pigs do take a little bit of time to be able to root, and if you can move them every day, every half day, you might really reduce the amount of rooting they're doing on a site, and then let that site recover. So I think we're about out of time here.
Yes,
I'll let Greg
come the hour, and
let me know that.
I think we can conclude the presentation now. Joe, thank you so much for the presentation and fielding the questions. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Agroforestry in Action .org website, so for on-demand viewing. So once again, thank you everyone for participating today, and thank you to Joe for that great presentation, and wish you a good day. Thanks so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it, and thanks everybody in Missouri for
future webinars. We have approximately every month, and on Wednesdays, and you can go to the, again, agroforestryinaction.org website and find more details of upcoming webinars and recorded versions of past webinars. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.